Hello again. In this episode, we venture to the mouth of Glen Coe to climb the amazing viewpoints of Creise and Meall. Along the way, we'll explore the history of the 250-year-old King's House and look back at the dawn of ski tourism in the Scottish Highlands. Plus, as we encroach upon what was once MacDonald territory, stick around for our deepest historical dive yet, as we chart the epic saga of Clan Donald, the Lords of the Isles. If you find yourself enjoying the show, hitting like and subscribe really helps the channel to grow and to create more free content like this for you to enjoy. And support us on Patreon, where for just £3 a month you can access exclusive, deeper content and downloads. Creise and Meall are two high Munros at the north end of the Black Mount, connected by a fine intervening ridge. The majestic Creise stands opposite Glen Moor at the head of Glen Etive, with its subsidiary top Swashbuckling, providing a suitably dramatic counterpart to the bealach. In contrast, Meall's more rounded summit rises above a somewhat less enchanting spectacle of chairlifts and ski tows on its north face. As we'll see, the Glen Coe ski centre pervades the north side of the mountain all the way up to the summit ridge. The ski centre car park is the usual starting point for these Munros, but alternatives via Swashbuckling or Glen Etive offer airy scrambling or longer grassy slopes to the summit of Creise respectively, from where the walker can bag Meall without being serenaded by the clanking of ski apparatus. The ski centre is reached from a turnoff on the A82. From the end of the road, a steep, stony path bears upward below the chairlifts to bealach, Corrie of the Peat. That means bog. Hereafter, the machinery is avoided as the route turns southwest onto the north ridge of Meall, an easy angled climb to the summit ridge, where the views become positively panoramic. Descending the fine but not sharp west ridge, the view over to Creise may look daunting, but the required scramble onto its summit ridge at Creise is actually pretty easy and unexposed, unless you're in winter, when large cornices form along the entirety of Creise's summit ridge. Bearing north, the summit of Creise soon presents itself, and it's worth continuing on to visit Swashbuckling at the north end of the ridge for excellent views to the bealach, and likewise Clach at the opposite end for smashing vistas south over Ba. There are two ridges of Swashbuckling, and both require handwork. The easier is the northeast ridge, a series of slabs and grassy corridors with little exposure, requiring no more than grade 3 scrambling. The other is Srón na Creise, the narrow nose, a vertiginous north ridge that is certainly not for the squeamish. Unrelentingly steep and exposed, this is for experienced scramblers only. Those with a head for height will certainly revel in its epic surroundings. If you don't fancy scrambling either of these routes down Swashbuckling, you'll need to reascend Meall on your way back to the ski centre, or descend southwest from Creise's summit and then northwest down grassy slopes into Glen Etive and follow the road back to the start. While the traverse to Creise may be difficult in winter, Meall is in fact one of the easiest winter Munros and a great place for those unexperienced in winter mountaineering to hone their basic skills.
Glen Coe. Hello again. Here we are, the head of Glen Coe and Glen Etive down there, and the great herdsman of Etive.
Bealach Moor.
Over there, the pointy tops of Creise and Meall, and our path beckoning us on below the ski centre there.
So without further ado, let's head on over there.
Here you can see the oft photographed Black Rock Cottage in front of the ski centre, which is owned by the Ladies Scottish Climbing Club. Beautiful, isn't it? And behind me here, you can see the West Highland Way, or rather Thomas Telford's lower road across the Black Mount that we learned about in episode 4, Goliath. If you don't fancy the look of that path, there is of course this chairlift here that you can take up and cut out the business end of the start route. Now basically heading between these two buildings here, it's signposted for hill walker scum like us who aren't going to spend any money at the facilities. As you can see, these are the original buildings from the 50s. Let's head on up there.
Recreational skiing on Meall likely began around a century ago. Facing onto Rannoch Moor, Coe and the north face of Meall were seen to regularly hold significant amounts of snow into spring and early summer. In the early 20th century, skiing in the Highlands was a difficult and adventurous undertaking that combined winter mountaineering with adrenaline-filled, high-octane descent. The risk of getting lost or being avalanched just added to the sense of adventure, with skiers entirely reliant upon their own reconnaissance and their own legwork. This recently discovered footage shows members of the Lowland Mountaineering Club skiing on Meall in 1939, making the most of what looks like great snow. What World War? In Europe, of course, alpine skiing was a well-established sport by this time, having burst into popularity around 1880. Early mountain resorts like Chamonix made a tidy profit selling hospitality, equipment and whatever else they could to their well-heeled continental clientele. By the 1940s, alpine and American ski centres had developed mechanised uplift, with ski lifts and cable cars bringing greater accessibility, and thus more visitors, to the major resorts. Already a popular tourist destination, Scotland's fine mountain areas, while enjoyed by the determined enthusiast, were still seen as relatively inaccessible to casual skiers less inclined towards map reading and mountaineering. The potential for an alpine-style ski centre in Scotland was apparent, and Glasgow engineer Philip Rankin proposed such a project on Meall. There was little interest from potential investors, so the determined Rankin went all in himself, quitting his job as an engineer to work full-time in bringing his ski centre dream to fruition. Built in 1956, the White Corries ski centre was Scotland's first ski resort, with a very steep run on the northeast face of Meall known as flypaper, offering a stern test for even the most hardened skiers. Its mechanised ski tool allowed rapid reascent and enabled record-breaking feats of skiing. In 1957, Bill Smith clocked in over 10,000 metres of downhill skiing in a single day, bagging an Everest in the process. The White Corries has endured through thick and thin, and is today branded the Glen Coe Mountain Resort, with chairlifts, tows, mountain biking, accommodation and a cafe in Coe. The success of the Glen Coe ski centre paved the way for its later counterparts on Cairngorm and the Nevis range, which, like them or loathe them, attract huge amounts of visitors, providing significant and much needed income for local businesses and public services.
To be honest, I'm not too keen on doing the path in this baking heat either, so I'm going to compromise, not taking the chairlift, but I'm going to take the track up here, which appears to be available for walkers to use. Onward! And just here at the first zigzag of the track, we get a beautiful view over Rannoch Moor and a rather unfamiliar view of some of the mountains that we climbed in Series 1 in the Southern Highlands. Can you name them all? Well, over there, beginning to see the Moors. There's the grey corries.
Stop Creise and stop a Curvein.
And just to point out, if you are coming up the track, keep an eye out for mountain bikes crossing it, because there's this red downhill mountain bike trail, lest you be run over by some adrenaline fueled mountain bikers. Not too far to Coorpollach now. Let's bash on up there. If you do want to take the path, be warned, it's mostly pretty steep. And further up there, it gets a little boggy too, to add to the fun. You've had your warning. Well, here we are on the footpath, having crossed underneath the chairlift here. You can see the remainder of Meall and its summit ridge up there. We're going to make our way up this right-hand skyline there. You can just about see a couple of people halfway up it. And up to the summit there, which is just to the right of the ski paraphernalia up in the summit ridge. Onward! At least they're out enjoying the hills. Oh, hiya. Now that we've managed to leave behind most of the tourist crowd, get a little bit of space and peace, thank goodness. And over there, the bealach, about 724 metres. And as you can see, the way is clear all the way up to the summit ridge. Hopefully there won't be as many people up there. Well, here we are at the bealach, starting to make our way up the North Ridge. But, oh yeah, look at that! Beautiful view over to the
Buchelia.
the Big Ben, Carnmore Gerac, Enich Moor. There's too many to name. Beautiful sculptures of stone, as you can see here, Shrona Creise as well. Gorgeous counterpoint to the
Big Buchelia.
Rannoch Moor, basking in the sunshine there. And onward, ahead lies a fairly straightforward path up to the summit of Meall. And over there you can see the junction with Creise, or the summit ridge of Creise, which looks pretty Creise from this direction, but it's not quite as intimidating as it looks, and it's fairly straightforward once you get up there, as we'll see. For now, let's get cracking to the top of Meall, and it's certainly not getting any cooler. Well, only mad dogs and Englishmen, as they say. It's currently 26 degrees, perilously close to being too hot for climbing a Munro. However, there's a bit of wind, so becoming a bit more bearable the higher up we go. Creise and Stoppa Coeur looking amazing, as indeed are the hills of Loch Aber over there. Well, here we are in the steeper section, the very last fifth, you would say, of Meall. The views over to the northwest continue to impress. The Ben showing its incredible size there. Quite a long way away, at least
15 miles away.
and still visibly taller than we are right now. Wow, it's a belter. You can see the northeast ridge here. This is a really good angle of it. Of Stoppa Coeur. You can see the fairly gentle angle compared to the way it appears from down there at King's House. As you can see, there's still a bit of scrambling involved in it, but it looks a hell of a lot more moderate than it does from down there. Scorchio. Here we are, the final furlong, the summit slopes near Lavuri. Super rocky, as you can see. Onward.
As its appearance suggests, Glen Coe had a dramatic upbringing. Rocks like these are volcanic, created during the Glen Coe cauldron subsidence, which is a hell of a lot more exciting than it sounds. A volcanic event so explosive that, put it this way, you would need an extremely large budget to successfully pull off on film. We'll look at Glen Coe's extraordinary geology as we progress further in.
Well, here we are, emerging onto the summit ridge of Meall, and it really is 360 degree oofed. Marvellous, isn't it? The vast expanse of Rannoch Moor there. Wow. Stunning vista down there to the south. The Bridge of Orkney Hills here. Creise Hills and the skyline behind. Queen of the South, Ben Louis there, iconic. Over there, Stop Gavar. Stop a Curur down here. Over there in the far distance, Ben Cruaken, Ben Achokul and Ben Unich. Ben Starav, another iconic mountain beside Glen Etive. Ben Scullard there. Ben Hinley. Sgwr na Hwley. And rising over Creise there, Bittian Nambian. Over there you can see Uirich Eich, the real one, the great notched ridge of Glen Coe. Now then, onward to Creise. Well, here we are, making our way down the west ridge, Meall. Very stony landscape. Over there you can see someone just approaching Mam Couraisian, which is the little indistinct top there. Now it protrudes a lot more than it looks like it does. It looks like it's pretty much you're going to be doing some grade 5 scrambling to get up to the ridge. As I say, it's coming out towards us as well, so don't let that put you off. Normally that would be like, am I sure I want to do that? But I'm just about keep my nerves down and bash on over there. Let's do it.
In previous episodes, we learned how, following the Jacobite defeat in 1746 at Culloden, a network of military roads was built across the Central Highlands for quicker troop deployment. Along these new so-called royal roads, stone buildings called king's houses were added at regular intervals to provide accommodation for troops on the march. Despite their name, however, these bunkhouses were far from kingly abodes. Most have fallen to ruin or been renamed in the intervening centuries, leaving only this one on the edge of wild Rannoch Moor. Built in 1752, around a half century after Inveroran, which we visited in Goliath, the King's House at Glen Coe has hosted countless soldiers, drovers, travellers, merchants, tourists and, of course, Munro baggers over its 270-year history. The original building is an iconic white cottage situated beside the contemporaneous Coldfields Bridge. It has to be said the original inn probably wouldn't have earned the greatest score on TripAdvisor. Remote, isolated and weather-swept, its standard of accommodation, let's say, put the bear in bare minimum. King's House was considered so unpleasant that the government had to offer a grant and free rent to any innkeeper willing to take it on. The less than sanitary nature of the establishment was well documented. In 1802, the surveyor of military roads thought it had more the appearance of a hogsty than an inn, while Dorothy Wordsworth was similarly unimpressed. Never did I see such a miserable, such wretched place. Long rooms with ranges of beds, no other furniture except benches, the floors far dirtier than an ordinary house could be if it was never washed. In 1819, Robert Southey wrote that it had handsome English china, but no bread. While conditions were no doubt pretty grim, one has to wonder what exactly these people were expecting from a remote little house on the wild Rannoch Moor for which they had paid less than a pittance. It couldn't exactly be mistaken for the Ritz. At the end of the day, its primary function was, and continued to be, somewhere to get drunk and fall asleep, and if you didn't like that, there was plenty of room out on the moor. Extended in 1960, the addition of the Walker's Bar greatly boosted its popularity. In 2014, King's House was sold to the Black Corries estate, bear with me, who demolished the 1959 extension and, against the express wishes of both the John Muir Trust and National Trust for Scotland among many others, replaced it with a large 3-storey hotel more akin to a Centre Parks than a Highland wilderness. The current King's House is without doubt cleaner and more comfortable, but viewers will draw their own conclusions regarding its character and aesthetics, or lack thereof. The path up Mam Coorisen is well worn and, as mentioned, at a much gentler angle than it looks. You'll soon find yourself on Creise's summit ridge, where the remainder of the walk becomes apparent. From here, Creise is basically bealach with screes, that is, a long, rounded and undulating ridge. There's nothing long about the stroll to the summit, however, and if you have the time to spare, the views from the Munro tops Stopia Last Kingshouse and Clach Lead reward with sumptuous vistas less photographed than most on these hills. If you're wondering why I'm not talking to the camera, Creise was so busy on our visit, it was actually impossible to get a moment's peace to do so. That'll teach us for climbing it on a sunny Saturday. Once on course for the summit, Glen Etive appears to the west, winding away below the Buachilias towards Ben Hinley, before turning south to Ben Starave and Loch Etive. Before you know it, you're at the summit, and the walker may be disappointed to find that it's not actually one of the points that you can see from King's House, but a fairly nondescript bump on a ridge full of them. The actual jagginess of Creise only begins beyond Stoppa Last Kingshouse, and to be honest, if that's what you're here for, you likely don't need any advice from me. For the less experienced, remember, down climbing is more dangerous than ascent, so while we can just about recommend going down via the northeast ridge with care in good weather, descent via Srón na Creise involves significant exposure, awkward, unintuitive moves, and challenging route finding that puts it firmly in the domain of the highly experienced scrambler. Creise's summit provides us with the IMAX version of the western panorama seen from Meall. Buachiliative Moor's graceful procession of tops is especially well showcased. And while this view to the northwest has been photographed more than Greyfriars Bobby, its majesty and character remain thoroughly undiminished. Now, for those unconvinced by my reassurance regarding the little bit of scrambling required to reach Creise from Meall up there, the bealach, well, our other option is to head down here into Glen Etive, to the rather more sedate western side of Creise. From there, we can find a way up to the summit ridge that, like the easy route on Stop Gavar, avoids any hands on rock or hands on grass or any use of your hands other than putting them in your pockets. From the turn-off on the A82, follow the Glen Etive road south. If you're in a hurry, the north-facing Fen Glen provides more direct access to the West Ridge, but it's rough boggy going with no path, so if you're looking for the route of least resistance, you'll want to continue down Glen Etive to Altcarran. From Altcarran Farm, follow the path below Ben Machaskig and up into the picturesque Cuernan Guvison, Corrie of the Fir Trees. This was once the edge of the Black Mount deer hunting estate, and the trail follows an old stalker's path. The path rises as the terrain gets stonier, and Clachlaid's West Ridge appears ahead, which may tempt the keen scrambler lamenting the otherwise abject lack of handwork. Beyond the junction with the Altcour Ur, the route bears left up steep grassy slopes to the bealach between Creise and Ben Machaskig at just under 700 metres. From here, it's an easy if unremarkable ascent up Creise's gentle west ridge to the summit. Hey, I didn't say it was going to be exciting, just easier. Mind you, the fine views back to Angrunen and Glen Etive somewhat make up for the extra legwork. And so we retrace our steps back along the ridge, the temperature thankfully dropping in the evening light, as we eventually return to base camp for a sunset that only Glen Coe can offer. Modern visitors to Glen Coe will often find out about the story of the MacDonalds and the infamous massacre of 1692, which we'll look at in depth in forthcoming episodes. But in order to understand the massacre, among other things, we need to know who the MacDonalds were, and it turns out that there's a great deal more to their history than Glen Coe, or even the massacre. Once, the MacDonald lineage ruled for over 400 years as Lords of the Isles, commanding a kingdom stretching from Argyll all the way up to Assynt and the Western Isles. It's time to find out who the MacDonalds were, and why the fall of their island kingdom had such dramatic and far-reaching consequences for Highland culture. The story of Clan Donald begins over 1,500 years ago, when what's now Scotland was inhabited by Pictish and Anglo-Saxon tribes. Two waves of immigration, firstly the Irish Celts and then the Vikings, would transform the society of the West Highlands and Islands, producing powerful Norse Gaelic dynasties that did battle for the Rhin and Yellen, the Kingdom of the Isles, or as they became known to the Scots, Innisgal, Islands of the Strangers. These strangers, the Norsemen, were so fearsome a foe that the warring Picts and Anglo-Saxons united in defence, forming the state of Scotland in the process. In Rhin and Yellen, however, there were two kinds of Norsemen, those who spoke Gaelic and those who spoke Norwegian, and, surprise surprise, they didn't get on. A Gaelic chieftain named Somerley MacGillibridge decided that there could be only one, the Gaels. He drove off the Norwegian dynasty from the kingdom, and the Western Highlands became a Gaelic-speaking domain. Somerled's descendants would form new clans, downplaying their Viking ancestry by assuming a prominent chief's given name, the most influential being Clan Donald. The name father of the Donald clan was Somerley's grandson, Doril MacRuil. The MacDonalds were made Lords of the Isles, and for nearly 200 years oversaw a vast area of Gaelic influence in the Highlands and Islands, becoming known to Highlanders as Burchelian nan Yellen, herdsmen of the Isles. The fall of their empire led to an age of violent upheaval in which the many affiliates of the MacDonalds faced persecution, numerous atrocities such as the Glen Coe massacre, and ultimately the grim road to the clearances. The epic saga of the MacDonalds helps us to understand the culture and social history of the Highlands, the roots and fate of Scottish Gaeldom, and why Scottish history turned so legendarily grim in the 16th century onwards. As such, it merits our deepest historical dive yet. Let's set the DeLorean to 563 AD, where it all began. There's lively academic debate over whether there were native Celts in Scotland prior to the 5th century, but it seems unlikely that there would not have been at least some. One factor in this debate is that the terms Celt and Gael are not synonymous. In Britain, Celtic languages included Manx from the Isle of Man, Welsh, Gaelic and Cornish. Celtic peoples came from Europe to England, Wales and Ireland, where the former spoke Brittonic and those in Ireland Gaelic. The Irish Celts later spread to Scotland in the 6th century and developed Scottish Gaelic. These Celtic immigrants established communities along the west coast of Scotland and its many isles, and a great Irish sea domain called Dal Rhita. This ancient Celtic kingdom, comprising Argyll, the west coast and islands of Scotland, as well as Antrim in Ireland, was a Gaelic-speaking territory from around the 6th to the 8th centuries. Fun fact, Argyll comes from Ard Gael, coast of the Gaels. Meanwhile in the east, at this time Scotland was not a unified entity, but a collection of regional kingdoms, usually fighting each other. As we saw in the Sentinel, the Irish missionary Columcille, later known as St Columba, was given lease of the tiny island of Iona in 563, bringing Christianity to Scotland and setting up the Celtic Church. Iona would become sacred ground to later generations of Gaels. The Celts had a vibrant culture of art, song and high technology. For example, among other innovations, they likely invented the barrel, a remarkable feat of engineering for the time. Celtic craftsmanship with stone, bronze and wrought iron was highly sophisticated, and its legacy endures in art and design to this day. For example, you may well be wearing some Celtic-themed jewellery. It could be said that the primary Celtic currency was cattle, with extensive vocabulary dedicated to describing the exact shade of brown by which a particular beast may be identified, while an individual's net worth could be reasonably determined by simply counting how many cows they owned. As we know, the followers of Columba then spread out into the mainland, and over the next 300 years, Gaelic language and wider Celtic tradition became common in the west of Scotland, with Iona the spiritual and intellectual centre of this expansion. Eventually, however, Scotland would have new overseas visitors, and these guys weren't coming to talk about Jesus Christ. In the mid-9th century, a savage new seaborne terror appeared in Britain. Fierce Scandinavian warriors in longboats who raided and occupied many parts of Scotland, Ireland and even northern England. Over the next 400 years, these Vikings, sea lords largely independent of Norway, came to hold various configurations of the Shetland and Orkney Isles, the Hebrides and the northwestern coastline of Scotland as their Norse Gaelic Kingdom of the Isles, but regularly raided most of northern Britain, ravaging and pillaging their way through many a vulnerable coastal community, including many Christian holy sites and monasteries such as Iona. For reasons that mostly boil down to revenge, the Vikings really didn't like Christianity, and the Celtic Church was mercilessly decimated by their successive raiding. Viking seems to mean those from the cove or bay. Vic in reference to the fjords from which they emerged, or more generally to those who weren't Viking, raider. In any case, the early Viking raiders were sadistic, merciless and opportunistic, serving no lord or agenda but their own enrichment and, it seems, entertainment. Some Viking chiefs even boasted in song of their summer raids as though they were adventure holidays, totting up their killings and booty against those of their peers upon their return. The Gaels in the northern islands of Scotland were utterly obliterated, while those in the Hebrides and the old Dalvita became thralls of the Norwegians, and suffice to say that there was no lower class than this in Viking culture. Thralls were treated as little more than slaves, and many Gallic men were taken to be sold as such, while the women were shipped to newly conquered Viking domains such as Iceland for marriage, servitude or worse, leaving a significant female Gallic genealogy in these areas. When it became clear that the Vikings weren't for leaving Scotland, Gallic and Scots leaders were obliged to engage with them in trade, diplomacy, and even in some cases marriage, to secure or expand their status and territory. During this period, and at this point any MacDonalds or MacDonalds listening may wish to cover their ears, Viking and Celtic bloodlines became intermixed. This shared genealogy formally came about through trade, cultural links and royal intermarriage, but unfortunately it doesn't take much imagination to identify the wider cause. Given the horrendous means by which this happened, it's understandable why the Norse Celtic genealogy has been played down by later generations of clansmen. The most significant of the new mixed dynasties was the great Norse Celtic House of Ivar, or E-Ivar. In the 11th century, this produced the Crovan dynasty of Godred Crovan, King of Dublin and the Isles, because he'd conquered the Isle of Man and parts of Ireland. The Crovans grew in stature, and in the 12th century, the latest heir, Olaf Godredsson Crovan, bestowed upon himself the title King of the Isles. Olaf's son, Godfrey the Black, eventually inherited this title, but his sister, Olaf's illegitimate daughter Ranild, had married the King of Argyll, Somerley MacGillibridge. Now, while they certainly wouldn't have won any respect from the Me Too movement, the Vikings were far more enlightened towards women than, well, to put it bluntly, many parts of the world are today. Viking tradition actually valued women, stop laughing, as equal to men, with the right of matriarch as valid as a patriarch. As long as they were Viking women, that is. Non-Viking women were, as we've mentioned, seen of lesser race and had precisely zero rights. So half a point for limited Viking women's rights ahead of their time. Kinda let yourselves down with the whole racial supremacy thing though. Somerled was a Gallic chieftain from Mull with a Norse mother and a powerful lineage supposedly stretching back to the High Kings of Ireland, such as Con of the 100 Battles. I'm just off to change my gamer tag. And now, through his marriage to Ranild, he could, and did, also claim the title King of the Isles. There was only one way this was going to end. In the 12th century, what's now Scotland was split between the Scots Kingdom of Alba to the east and the Norse Kingdom of the Isles in the west, the latest ruler of which, the aforementioned Godfrey the Black, or Godfrey of the White Hand, or God, these nicknames, seems to have been particularly unpleasant even for a Viking. Somerled, who had already conquered Argyll back from the north, emerged as a new third power to challenge the status quo, starting with his brother-in-law. While Somerled's primary motivation seems to have been to extend his power and territory to the north, the Vikings occupied his homeboy turf, Morvern on the east coast of Mull, and Somerled decided to take back this land of his inheritance. He set forth across the Sound of Mull with an armed force, and the inevitable war with Godfrey commenced. Initially outnumbered, Somerled's plucky force drove the Vikings from Mull and captured some of their longboats in the process. These vessels enabled him to take on the Vikings on the open sea, but he needed far more vessels to launch an all-out assault on the Norwegian fleet itself. Traditional Hebridean galleys were slow, cumbersome, and no match for the Vikings in battle. Somerled had a new fleet of galleys, or bealach, designed to be smaller, faster, and crucially more manoeuvrable, with a shallower draft than the longboat. But their most significant innovation was the hinged, keel-mounted rudder. It's almost inconceivable that the Vikings, having crossed the Atlantic and sailed around half the globe, hadn't thought of this before, but then hindsight is a wonderful thing, as was Celtic ingenuity. Viking longboats, or dragon ships, were turned by using a large oar lashed to the stern called a steering board or steerboard, and this is the origin of the nautical term starboard. The development of a hinged, keel-mounted rudder gave Somerled a decisive advantage, as it enabled his forces to outmaneuver the Vikings in shallow inlets and sea locks, while their smaller size endowed them with a speed and responsiveness the Vikings simply could not match. These Navigan, or little ships, were key to defeating Crovin's fleet in a massive nocturnal battle off Colonsay. Such sea battles between Gaels and Vikings would have been spectacularly brutal affairs. First, arrows would be exchanged between the ships, grappling hooks would be thrown onto each vessel, and then each side would proceed to hack the other to pieces with sword or axe. Somerled's bealachs also featured long helms and fighting tops on the masthead, from which archers could inflict significant casualties at close range. It's said that Somerled had 58 of these vessels built to take on Godfrey's dragon ships. In confrontations like that of Colonsay, imagine hundreds of men in dozens of vessels doing this in close proximity, torches ablaze amid the spray, war cries and flying arrows of the Atlantic night. The smooth-handled oars, well-fashioned, light and easy, that will do the rowing stout and sturdy, quick-palmed, blazing, that will send a surge in sparkles, up to skyward, all in a dying spindrift dashing like a fire shower, with the fierce and pithy pelting of the oarbank that will wound the swelling billows with their bending, with the knife blades of the white thin oars smiting bodies on the crest of the blue hills and glens, rough and heaving. The Gallic victory forced a peace treaty by which Godfrey Crovin initially retained Skye and the Outer Hebrides, but eventually Somerled won these too. Godfrey eventually accepted defeat in the face of this superior naval power, forcing the Norwegians from the Kingdom of the Isles. Somerled would go down in history as the man who drove off the Vikings, but given he was part Viking himself, which is somewhat given away by his traditional name Somerled the Viking, it would be more accurate to say that he drove off the Norwegians. Viking culture and language remained an inextricable part of Northwest Highland identity, as evidenced by the shared genealogy and place names like A, pronounced for island, Vik, bay, so Uvik, and Val from the Norse fjell for mountain. An example of this among the Munros is Conneval in Ascent. After defeating Godfred, Somerled now ruled a vast Gallic kingdom along the west coast, a sovereign state distinct from Scotland to the east. He built a new series of castles to guard against Viking reprisal, restored the monastery at Iona, and began to significantly expand his territory east onto the mainland. However, Somerled eventually bit off more than he could chew. In 1164, as a result of a dispute over territory with the Lord of Renfrew, Somerled led a force of around 165 galleys and 15,000 men up the Clyde, disembarking at Greenock and marching to roughly where the Erskine Bridge spans the river today. King Malcolm IV of Scotland backed Renfrew, and the Scots army mobilised to meet the advancing Gaels. catching them unawares at, surprise surprise, Renfrew. Somerled may have been master of the seas, but on land he met an unseemly demise. Depending on which side you listen to, Somerled was either valiantly killed in battle or murdered in his sleep, and his advance army was defeated at the Battle of Renfrew. However, his generals were suspiciously quick to organise the retreat, and the war fleet and most of the army escaped back to the west, with the Kingdom of the Isles to be divided between his descendants, the clan Sorley, with the Outer Hebrides retaken by the Norse. Ranald inherited the war fleet and much of the Gallic army, as well as territory on Skye and Islay, making Ranald the most powerful branch of Somerled's kin. It's here that Somerled's grandson, Dorel MacRuil, enters the picture, producing a new dynasty, the Children of Donald, or MacDonald. Given recent history, they wisely sought to ally themselves with the crown rather than openly antagonise it. Donald's grandson, Angus More, literally Big Angus, became Lord of Islay under Alexander III of Scotland, when said king defeated the Norwegian Hakon IV, permanently retaking the Outer Hebrides for Scotland. In contrast to their grandfather, the MacDonalds would now court the favour of the Scottish crown by referring to themselves as lords instead of kings, and generally playing nice with the monarch. This strategy would eventually pay off, and then some. A 100 years later, during the wars of Scottish independence that we learned about in the Hollow Mountain, Angus Og MacDonald, or Young Angus, gave shelter and armed support to Robert the Bruce, and as we know, those who had allied with Robert in war could expect a hefty Brucey bonus in return. His supporters were given the land of his defeated enemies, a kingly gift indeed, as now more than ever, land meant money, and money meant power. The MacDonalds were granted Earldom of the Hebrides, and later, John of Islay was bestowed with the hereditary title of Lord of the Isles, with his men taking up the hallowed right-wing position in the King's Scottish army. John of Islay was certainly prolific. His first marriage produced the branches of Clan Ranald and Glengarry, while his second marriage to Bruce's granddaughter Margaret, no less, increased the standing and esteem of House Donald and produced many future clan chiefs. The MacDonald kingdom now extended from the Mull of Kintyre in Argyll to Lochalshire and Sint in the north, and all the isles in between, with the centre of their power located on the Inner Hebrides of Mull, Islay and Skye, hence the title Lords of the Isles. Their influence was vast. Under the MacDonalds, the Gaelic clan system flourished, with its principles of fair rule, communal pasture, the code of honour and hospitality, and a rich culture of art and song. If there was ever a golden age of Gaeldom in the Highlands, this period, along with that of Somerled, would be a strong contender. The elite MacDonald families would meet on Islay to discuss and administrate their empire, with the ruling chiefs holding a supreme court on Yellin na Corla, the Council Island, a tiny islet on Loch Finlagan, to keep the clansfolk from overhearing or interfering. Next to this, and connected by causeway, was Yellin Moor, the Great Island, on which was located the MacDonald capital, a great house with many dining halls, grand rooms and stables. MacDonald Lords of the Isles were inaugurated on the Stone of Destiny. No, not that one. Or that one. This was a sacred slab bearing a carved footprint that had been in ceremonial use since the time of Somerled. The new lord would place his foot in the imprint, symbolically following in the footsteps of his forebears. In 1615, the Campbell Earl of Argyll had the stone broken and thrown away, which isn't petty or anything. The stone was thus presumed lost until the 1890s, when a gardener noticed it in passing just below the surface of the loch. However, he didn't think to mention this to anyone until the 1960s, when the stone was recovered and restored to its former resting place on the Yellen na Curla. Along with the carved footprint, the stone was also inscribed with the twin symbols of the Lordship of the Isles, the Great Sword, representing Clandonald's sovereignty on land, and the Little Ship of Navig, denoting their sovereignty on sea. If you happen across a ruined castle on the west coast of Scotland, the odds are that it was built by the MacDonalds, or even earlier by Somerled. At Armadale Castle on Skye, a MacDonald residence from around 1650, there's now a museum, library, heritage centre and a genealogy archive, where modern Clandonald members can investigate their rich ancestry. Numbering in excess of 20 million today, in terms of current living descendants, Somerled is second only to Genghis Khan. The MacDonalds' rule was in no way democratic, but neither was it a tyrannical dictatorship. A clan chief roundly seen as acting unfairly, for example, could be removed by clan members, although this probably worked better in theory than in practice. Clans were generally left to manage their lands as they saw fit, as long as they didn't cause any trouble or encroach upon MacDonald holdings. Of course, it wasn't all fun and games. The MacDonalds regularly fought over territory with rival clans like the MacLeans, for example, but their sea empire was utterly immovable. The naval might and high social standing of the clan ensured that no one, not even the Scottish crown, could realistically threaten their dominion. No one, that is, except themselves. For centuries, kings had sought to assert the reign of the all-powerful MacDonalds. Their might and influence rivaled the Scottish monarchy, but when new kings on the block, the Stuarts, appeared with desires to bring the Gaelic Empire under Scots rule, the MacDonalds became royal enemy number one. In 1462, John II, Lord of the Isles, made a spectacularly ill-considered agreement with King Edward IV of England, the Old Enemy, against James III of Scotland, in which they basically agreed to split up the land of Scotland between them. Of course, this never happened. It probably seemed like a good idea to John at the time to make this bargain. It may well have made sense tactically, but the choice of ally was always going to be a sore point to any Scotsman, let alone his own clan. When hostilities between Edward IV and James III abated in 1476, Edward told James of the agreement that he had made with the MacDonalds. An angry James now had the proverbial smoking gun by which he could finally move against Clandonald without risking all-out Highland uprising. James reasoned, probably correctly, that given the MacDonalds had collaborated with the Old Enemy, their sullied reputation among Highlanders would make said Highlanders somewhat less likely to join the MacDonald cause in battle. The Scottish Parliament declared John's earldom forfeit, and large mainland areas of the MacDonald Empire fell under the control of the Scottish Crown. The clan were allowed to keep the remainder of their lands, that in the Hebrides and Skye, as well as other smaller mainland territories, plus their formal title of Lords of the Isles, but in reality their actual power, influence and reputation was becoming severely diminished. Henceforth, the heir to the Scottish throne, not the MacDonalds, would decide and later hold the title themselves of Lord of the Isles, a tradition which continues this day with this guy. Yep, that's right, this is the current Lord of the Isles, which makes a mockery of its heritage. These developments led John's son, Angus Og, yep, another young Angus, with the support of many of his clan, to turn against his father in an effort to wrestle from him the power of the kingdom before he destroyed it completely. Angus fought off the invading Scottish army on 3 consecutive occasions, while his father, wise once the horse had bolted, refused to resist. But these were temporary victories. Oral tradition has it that Angus was so angry upon learning the truth that he threw his father out of the house and made him sleep under an old rotting boat. And if you think that's bad, it escalated quickly. All-out war soon consumed Clan Donald, as father and son did battle for the soul of the institution in a series of increasingly violent confrontations. Far from saving the kingdom, this ruthless civil war would prove to be the last nail in the coffin for the MacDonald Empire. At some point between 1480 and 1483, the internecine conflict reached its brutal conclusion at the Battle of Bloody Bay, just north of Tobermory off Mull, where Angus eventually defeated his father in what must have been one of the largest and, well, bloodiest sea battles ever seen in Britain. However, this was the very definition of a Pyrrhic victory. Angus may have won the day, but now most of the MacDonald's expensive and technologically advanced war fleet lay wrecked on the seabed, permanently ending their naval dominion and with it any chance of recovering their kingdom. While Angus and his father lived on, they were lords of the Isles in name only. Angus continued the battle against his father's supporters in the remaining MacDonald lands before being mysteriously poisoned, while John, the last Lord of the Isles, was officially stripped of his lordship in 1493 and died in poverty in Dundee, the first MacDonald chief not to be buried in the clan's spiritual home of Iona. The Masters of the Seas had finally been brought low. With their navy decimated, they were a spent force on the waves, while the sweeping forfeiture of their lands had massively reduced their income and with it their influence on, and social standing within, Highland society. The Lords of the Isles were no more, and their kingdom had fallen. With their lordship now forfeit, the MacDonalds and the Highlands faced an uncertain future. Clan Donald had been a force for order and stability among the clans, and as their power withered, it was replaced by lawlessness and banditry. So began Lyn and Creise, the age of the Corries. The MacDonalds were essentially bit players now like the rest of the clans, and this was no doubt the source of much resentment, as was the fact that their forfeited mainland territories were being given to clans faithful to the crown. Oh, the irony. Smaller MacDonald families in the Central Highlands, like for example McKeon and Glengarry, would no longer receive the level of protection or financial aid upon which they had hitherto relied. Thus, they and many other clans were forced to work the land, and later to resort to cattle theft, the aforementioned forays from which this age takes its name. Much of this theft was committed against Campbell of Glen Lyon, who, as we know from Series 1, now occupied former MacGregor territory. As nasty as the Glen Coe massacre was, it was simply the latest in a long line of atrocities, and in terms of scale, there were, unfortunately, far worse. One of the most horrific was surely the Frang massacre. In 1577, the MacLeod chief Alistair Crotoch, literally the cripple, invaded the MacDonald Isle of Egg, and when the resident families saw them coming, they fled to hide in the cavernous Frang, or Cave of Francis. The most bloodthirsty of the MacLeod leaders, Crotoch discovered their hiding place and proceeded to light a fire in the entrance to the cave, suffocating the entire population of the island, around 400 people, including women and children, within. This outrageous act of inhumanity is sadly little known compared to the botched Glen Coe operation, which, for context, resulted in around 70 deaths. Of course, there's more to Glen Coe than just the numbers, as we'll see, but surely the suffering of the families in Frang deserves as much remembrance as any of the McKeons in Glen Coe. In the 19th century, a visiting geologist found the cave to be filled with masses of human skeletons, huddled together in small groups. Out of respect, this grisly cache was removed and buried in the island churchyard. Now it should be noted that while the MacDonalds were not always the victims of mass murder, indeed they perpetrated a few themselves, The indiscriminate slaughter at Umfrang was shocking even to grizzled Highlanders. This was something that the Vikings would have done. Along with the MacDonalds in the cave, belief and adherence to the Highland Code of Honour was slowly beginning to die, and for those who remembered the stability brought about by the Lords of the Isles, the Highlands were descending into a Hobbesian nightmare. As we know, this growing division and distrust in the Highlands was all being carefully manipulated by those who stood to benefit most from the resulting chaos, and if you need a reminder, that was generally the guy wearing a crown. Royal intelligence operatives, military lieutenants, and armies of conscripted Gaels now policed the Highlands in the MacDonalds' stead, and let's just put it this way, it would be quicker to count the occasions on which justice was served than those in which the only services provided by this new police force were brutality, corruption, and shameless nepotism. The order and stability of the honour system had been replaced by the peace of the gun. To quote a contemporaneous Gaelic refrain, it is no joy without Clandonald. The decline of Highland Gaeldom, or Gaeltacht, accelerated in the 17th century when James VI abducted the prominent clan chiefs and, in exchange for their freedom, forced them to sign the Statutes of Iona, which decreed that all sons of the chiefs were to be educated in the Lowlands, England or Europe, and crucially taught English, not Gaelic. Protestant ministers were sent to preach in the north, and most Gaels lost the right to bear arms, while bards and poets, our main source of Gaelic social history, were banned, along with the tradition of hospitality and banqueting. Other such less than subtle tactics were used to devalue and degrade Gaelic culture over the following centuries, with the ultimate aim of nothing less than its wholesale eradication. Even William Shakespeare joined in this propaganda campaign in his play Macbeth, where Celtic culture was almost comically presented as dark, unholy and malevolent in comparison to the noble, civilised lowland King Malcolm. The irony is again certainly strong with this one. Worse, other Highland clans knowingly became complicit in this programme of social cleansing, and there's no prize for guessing the most prominent of these. In Rise of the Campbells, we learned how the decline of the MacDonalds' power and influence in Highland politics left a power vacuum which Clan Campbell, among others, were able to exploit. Much of the, it has to be said, unpleasant ensuing history of the Highlands has its roots in this downfall of the MacDonald Lords of the Isles. The Campbells now replaced the MacDonalds as the most powerful clan at the top of the pyramid, an ignominious pill indeed for the children of Donald to swallow, especially as the Campbells were increasingly perceived as loyalists, or, in other words, royal enablers, as well as being in thrall of lowland and English influence, that is to say, capital. These are major factors in the MacDonalds, and many other clans for that matter, historic resentment of Clan Campbell. In the eyes of many, they had betrayed the Highland cause for their own aggrandisement. Now, this is a fairly accurate indictment, as we know, but let's not pretend that they were alone in doing this, nor would the MacDonalds themselves be fully innocent of such a charge in the centuries to come. But that's a story for another time. Such was the MacDonalds' situation at the time of the Glen Coe massacre. As we progress through Glen Coe in further episodes, we'll try to explain the complex social and political web of intrigue that lurks behind the brutal events of February 1692. Of course, the MacDonalds' story continues beyond Glen Coe, and we'll pick up their narrative again when we visit the islands of Mull and Skye later in the series. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, hit like and subscribe to see new episodes as soon as they arrive. And to support the show, hit us up on Patreon, where for just £3 a month you can get exclusive content and behind the scenes updates, as well as that warm fuzzy feeling of knowing that you're helping us to create more episodes of your favourite Munro documentary. Until next time, enjoy your adventures.